I want to welcome all the people we're remembering into the room right now. I feel it's a full place in a good way. What happens after we die? It's common in Reform Judaism to teach we don't know. And we often leave it there because we don't know. We don't know what happens. But I've grown to find this answer unsatisfying. One of the fundamental purposes of a religion is to help us grapple with the big questions. And even if we actually can't fully answer them, Judaism offers a deep well of tradition. For this Yizkor service, as we gather to remember beloveds, I thought it might be of comfort to explore a few of the ideas our tradition has about what happens after we die. I do think it's also important to talk about why we have such an ambiguous relationship to this in Judaism. Simcha Paul Raphael, who wrote the book Jewish Views of the Afterlife, suggests that it was in part the Holocaust, that we couldn't make spiritual sense of losing 6 million of us. And so all we were left with was what was empirically knowable. It's a decidedly not spiritual orientation, but it was important for post-Holocaust Jews. But I think this ignores something that many of us understand somewhere inside us. We don't totally lose our loved ones. They are somehow still present. We might not have language for it or fully believe it ourselves, yet there is something. And so then the question is, how can we have, with our science-believing rational selves, a spiritual relationship to death? One classic understanding that I want to offer today is this idea that our souls go to Gan Eden, the Garden of Eden, which is probably the closest thing we have in Judaism to heaven. In the Torah, the Garden of Eden is the opposite of death. It's the birthplace of life. It is the place before problems, before violence, before loss. It is lush, beautiful, bursting with flowers, filled with animals, birds. Try something with me for a moment. Close your eyes and bring yourself to Gan Eden, to the Garden of Eden. Imagine what it sounds like, feels like, smells like. Maybe there's soft grass under you, the sound of water. Just take a quiet moment to be present there. Perhaps you imagine a loved one in this place, free of pain, free of sorrow and regret. You can open your eyes. That's just one possible glimpse of what our tradition offers. Here's another one. The Kabbalists, the mystics, teach about something called Gilgul, which means something like a cycle or a wheel. And it is in this Kabbalistic tradition where we find the closest thing in Judaism to reincarnation. It's not widely embraced today, but there have been periods in our history where it certainly was. and even among major figures like the Baal Shem Tov and the Vilna Gaon. There is one particular teaching from Kabbalah that suggests that we are reincarnated enough times for our souls to fulfill all 613 mitzvot. In other words, sometimes we die before our work is done, and somehow our souls come back to complete the work. Could the idea of Gilgul find a place in your spiritual understanding of death? And even if you don't embrace literal reincarnation, I don't think I do, are these not my grandfather's hands? I know I have my grandmother's sense of humor. There are moments when all of a sudden we see ancestors in our children. Another concept I spoke about at Yizkor about 4 years ago is the idea of Mechaye HaMetim, that the dead come back, literally the resurrection of the dead. It's another idea that I'm not so comfortable with in a literal sense. However, spiritually, I do believe that when we tell the stories of our loved ones, that when we think of them in a moment, they come back. There's actually a way they come back. And that in itself is a spiritual truth. One more. It's not exactly an idea of what happens after we die, but it's related. And that is the idea of lament. The act, ritualized or spontaneous, of crying out to God in the face of loss. Rabbi Rachel Adler writes, in laments, human beings bewail all that hurts about being human, having bodies that hurt, being mortal, suffering brutality at the hands of others, losing control over our lives, losing kin, losing home, losing freedom, being tormented by memories of happier times or by memories of horrific occurrences, feeling abandoned by an indifferent or actively punitive God. Lament, crying out, she teaches, brings us into a relationship with God that is honest, a relationship in which our pain and anger, including our anger at God, can be held. Many Jewish cultures actually used to have professional lamenters, often women, who did the sacred work of crying out as part of funeral rites, following the casket and procession. And this tradition was apparently maintained as recently as the 1950s among some Iraqi Jews. While a ritual of lament does not directly answer the question of what happens after we die, the act of crying out to God supposes that we are not alone in our grief, and that God can hear our protest and our sorrow. It is also the opposite of the dreaded comments that well-meaning people sometimes make to mourners, such as, God never gives you more than you can handle, or at least your loved one's not suffering anymore. These attempts to soothe mourners or make meaning out of something that feels so meaningless does not leave room for anger and grief. Lament does. How do you make spiritual sense of death? Do you give yourself the space to do so? One of the blessings of practicing a tradition that has been practiced for so many generations is that we have built-in wisdom that can help us go deeper, which may ultimately lead to healing and wholeness after the heartbreak of loss. However you think about what happens when we die, I want to bless all of us today that our loved ones, in whatever sense we relate to them, be close to us, today and always. May their memories be a blessing.